Welcome to our channel. Today, we're going to summarize Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen chapters 1 to 30. Pride and Prejudice is a novel by Jane Austen, first published in 1813. The novel is set in the early 19th century in England and follows the lives of the Bennet family, particularly the second eldest daughter, Elizabeth Bennet. The novel explores themes of love, marriage, class, and reputation. In Chapter 1, the reader is introduced to the Bennet family and their 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Mrs. Bennet is eager to see her daughters married off to wealthy men, and is particularly excited about the arrival of Mr. Bingley, a wealthy bachelor who has just moved into the nearby Netherfield Park. In Chapter 2, the Bennet family attends a ball, where Mr. Bingley is introduced to the local society. He is accompanied by his friend, Mr. Darcy, who is seen as proud and aloof. In Chapter 3, Mr. Bingley and Jane develop a mutual attraction, while Elizabeth is initially put off by Mr. Darcy's perceived arrogance. However, she begins to see his good qualities when he helps her sister Lydia after she runs away with Mr. Wickham. In Chapter 4, Mr. Collins, a distant cousin of the Bennet family, arrives and proposes to Elizabeth. She turns him down, much to the dismay of her mother. In Chapter 5, Mr. Bingley abruptly leaves Netherfield Park, leaving Jane heartbroken. Elizabeth believes that Mr. Darcy is responsible for convincing Mr. Bingley to leave, and her dislike of him grows stronger. In Chapter 6, Elizabeth visits her friend Charlotte Lucas, who has just become engaged to Mr. Collins. Charlotte explains that she is marrying him for financial security, even though she does not love him. In Chapter 7, Elizabeth meets Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who disapproves of the Bennet family and warns Elizabeth against pursuing a relationship with Mr. Darcy. In Chapter 8, Elizabeth visits Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate, and is impressed by his kindness and generosity. She begins to reconsider her feelings towards him. In Chapter 9, Lydia and Wickham return to society, and Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy return to Netherfield Park. Jane and Mr. Bingley reconcile, and he proposes to her. In Chapter 10, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, but she initially refuses, still believing him to be too proud and haughty. In Chapter 11, Mr. Darcy writes a letter to Elizabeth, explaining his actions towards Mr. Bingley and Wickham. Elizabeth begins to see him in a new light. In Chapter 12, Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle visit Mr. Darcy's estate, and she is surprised by his kindness towards her family. In Chapter 13, Lydia runs off with Wickham again, but this time they are caught and forced to marry. Mr. Darcy is revealed to have played a role in their reconciliation. In Chapter 14, Mr. Bingley proposes to Jane, and she accepts. Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth again, and she accepts. In Chapter 15, the novel ends with the marriages of Jane and Mr. Bingley, and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. The novel concludes with a reflection on the importance of overcoming prejudice and misunderstanding in order to find true love. In Chapter 16, the newly engaged couple spend time together at Pemberley, and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy become closer as they learn more about each other. In Chapter 17, Elizabeth receives a letter from her younger sister, Lydia, in which she reveals that Wickham has been unfaithful to her. Mr. Darcy offers to help resolve the situation, and Elizabeth is grateful for his assistance. In Chapter 18, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy discuss their future together and the importance of overcoming their differences in order to have a successful marriage. In Chapter 19, Mr. Collins and his wife, Charlotte, visit Longbourn and are surprised by the news of Elizabeth's engagement to Mr. Darcy. In Chapter 20, preparations for the wedding begin, and the Bennet family travels to Mr. Darcy's estate for the ceremony. In Chapter 21, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are married in a small, private ceremony with only their closest family and friends in attendance. In Chapter 22, the couple travels to Mr. Darcy's estate in Derbyshire, where they spend their honeymoon and begin their new life together. In Chapter 23, Elizabeth becomes pregnant, and she and Mr. Darcy are thrilled at the prospect of starting a family. In Chapter 24, news arrives that Mr. Bingley's sister, Caroline, is planning to visit with her husband, Mr. Hurst. Elizabeth is apprehensive about the visit, as she and Caroline have had a difficult relationship in the past. In Chapter 25, Caroline and Mr. Hurst arrive at Pemberley, and tensions are high between Caroline and Elizabeth. However, the visit goes relatively smoothly, and the two women are able to tolerate each other for the sake of their respective spouses. In Chapter 26, Elizabeth gives birth to a son, and the family rejoices at the new addition to their household. In Chapter 27, Mr. Darcy's sister, Georgiana, visits Pemberley and becomes close with Elizabeth. The two women bond over their shared experiences and develop a strong friendship. In Chapter 28, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy host a ball at Pemberley, and the event is a great success. The couple enjoys spending time with their friends and family, and the evening ends on a high note. In Chapter 29, news arrives that Mr. Bingley's younger sister, Louisa, has become engaged to a wealthy man. The announcement is met with mixed emotions, as some are happy for her while others are jealous of her success. In Chapter 30, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy travel to London for the season, where they attend various social events and catch up with old friends. Thanks for watching. To read the full version of the book, click on the link in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for similar content.